Well, I am thrilled as always to invite Jeff Lutz back to the show. Jeff is somebody who has become I guess you're the C-suite guy.
I'm just a person hanging out, having a conversation with you and others, and love the tech.
Well, but there's, different folks come from different perspective. So I'm the guy who's run a bunch of small companies and who's written a bunch of books on small companies. Other guys come at it from the standpoint of maybe a very, like Dylan, a heavy, finance, background, very, very big finance background. People come at it from all these different directions, but you come at it, you're probably the one guy that we have in the community that has a big C-suite background. And so I think that's how you're seen, as the guy from the C-suites. Anyway, so but what we're going to talk about today is partially around that. We want to talk about China. This is part of a series. Everybody needs to hit notify because this is just this is the third part in a four-part series. And tomorrow morning, Larry Goldberg and I will be wrapping it up and kind of looking at everything that happened between the first conversation with Larry, conversation that you might have seen yesterday with Brian Wong, and now with Jeff, talking about China, India, all of Asia, basically. And we're going to throw Australia in there just for fun and count them as part of Asia. So, Jeff, talk to me. We are probably going to be having a plant, not we, of course, Tesla, because we are owners. All right. So
Mhm.
we're probably going to be having a plant in India. And what do you give the percentage right now? What do you think the percentage is that's going to be India?
I mean, I would say probably greater than 70%. The two principals have met, Elon and Modi, and usually most of the issues are off the table, and there's kind of small things that are that would occur after that. So I would think pretty high percentage.
Okay. And they could have opened a second plant in China. I mean, they've been doing well in China. They did well in terms of how fast they built it. They've done well in terms of their sales. They've done well in terms, apparently, of the relationship with the folks in China. Everything seems to be going swimmingly in China, and everybody, I think, kind of thought they would open a second plant in China. That didn't happen. What's your thinking?
Well, they're certainly expanding in China, but and thanks for the intro again. I do right now. I do have my own consulting firm, and I do speak with companies. Some are mega cap as well in terms of supply chain design, the geopolitical aspects of supply chain, and I have set up manufacturing in many countries, including China and India. So I can kind of speak to this from a number of different angles. There's a lot of reasons. So what's happened since COVID, since 2019, and there's been a number of things happening. One is obviously we had this pandemic. We've also had, I would say there's border disputes heating up between China and India. There's obviously a big dispute between China and Taiwan. So there's a number of reasons, and of course, there's a lot of things happening with trade between multiple reasons as well. So when you take those three or four factors together, there's plenty of reasons for companies to want to be more diverse in terms of their ability to source product, as well as also their proximity to a major customer base of 1.6 billion people in India who are economically growing in terms year on year. They're growing, and there's a number of reasons, both geopolitically, economically, and of course getting your source of supply as close to your customer base as possible to want to look to India. So it's not only Tesla, many other auto companies, and quite frankly, the consumer electronics world has been out in front and ahead of this. Back, more than 10 years ago, there's been moves made to, set up manufacturing and supply chain in India. And the key thing with India, and we can probably get into it more, they have a protectionist economy when it comes to manufacturing. So in general, if it's of high value to them and you're not manufacturing it there, they're going to put very high import duties for you to do business in that country. So with that kind of economy, you've got to think more broadly about how do you get access to that population.
Yeah, so of course, Tesla famously had been kind of knocking on the door for a couple of years, asking for some special treatment with regard to importing into India, and kind of as a test, let us test the market, and after we test, then we'll come in and build a plant. And India's like, no, not so much.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's changed since then is obviously Tesla has grown in influence and becoming the clear market leader in EV, and also it's the competition isn't as close as I think others may have thought they were. And the other thing that's changed is China has emerged as an EV and auto export leader. So a production leader for China, an export leader in autos, and a leader in EV. And India has to be looking at this and looking at the size of their economy and looking at what's happening with China and their ability to basically garner this entire industry and build it out. And they have to be looking at it. And over that last couple of years, since Tesla knocked on the door to now, Tesla's grown in influence in both in India, seeing what's happening in China. Said, look, we can't continue to fall that far behind. So I actually believe Tesla's in a very good position from a negotiating leverage perspective in this relationship.
So, all right. So now let's go back to China in terms of why not, as opposed to why. So you've mentioned, of course, that there's been these, specific border disputes with India, issues with Taiwan. How much of it do you think is even Elon? He's got a kind of a political side of him, a fairly strong political side of him. Do you think there's anything going on there in terms of his belief that we don't want China to be so dominant?
Yeah, I mean that could be part of it. I mean, but Tesla is expanding inside of China, so I think outwardly you're going to hear Elon and Tesla be very supportive of China. I think they're supportive of peace, but they're also supportive of China, the Chinese people, and they're growing production there. I mean, they're expanding battery production. They obviously added the Megapack factory. They're expanding the motor inverter production significantly. Those are significant upgrades. I think we're on the order of 30 to 40% more capacity being added to build those sub-assemblies for manufacturing. So, and they've converted into a major export hub
Right.
as well. Now that may decline a bit with Berlin, and it is, but in general, they're still exporting all over in multiple countries. So Elon and Tesla have done well for China, and not only that, they've brought a lot of knowledge to China, even though they're not a joint venture. But I mean, when Chinese laborers come in and Chinese management come in to work at Tesla and get trained in the Tesla system and go elsewhere, in the country, they're bringing some knowledge with them. Is it IP? Not necessarily, but it's certainly know-how.
Yeah, and so assuming then that Tesla is still growing in China, but they didn't set up a second full manufacturing facility like some thought they would in some other region, or even in the same region. Um, it seems as if I agree with you that a principal part of that would be to diversify their sourcing, to get closer to the India population and maybe some other populations that'll even be closer in terms of export. But would any of it have had to do with kind of the regime in China, do you think?
Yeah, obviously that could certainly be a part of the equation. We'll never, we
Hear
won't
that?
hear about that, yeah, as much. But the fact that there's you know there's a lot of things happening geopolitically. It's both China getting closer with some of these other countries, and what's happening with trade. Um, there's a number of reasons. Um, there's a number of reasons to want to diversify supply. I mean, and then of course, if you take the Taiwan situation, and if that happens overnight, you can just think about the amount of dollars and the amount of product that would be you would have been exporting out of China that you may run into problems with overnight. and the ability to get supply as well. So setting up inbound and outbound supply lanes and diversifying that is a good thing for Tesla. India, if they were to set up India, India could even export, they can export all over Europe. They've got great agreements. They could export even to the United States. I've been in a position where I've seen it personally, where we had an issue with the source of supply in China, and we're able to cut over, to India and being able to export to the U.S. no problem. So there's a number of reasons to do that. Geopolitics is certainly, in the equation.
Right. So in China, they now have as you said, an extremely large auto business. I believe I saw a headline the other day that they will be the largest exporter in the world shortly, if not already, of automobiles and certainly of EVs. And that curve seems to be like this as opposed to not. So they've now developed a substantial expertise. Does India have that same kind of expertise that they can bring to in terms of employees, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of construction, et cetera, or will Tesla need to bring a lot of that with them?
Yeah, that remains to be seen. I mean, there's certainly contract manufacturers, there's certainly auto assembly happening in India. So we can't necessarily write that off. But in terms of like a global EV player, there isn't anyone exporting out of India to my knowledge. And BYD has started exports to other countries, but I even think BYD is going to struggle with localization of their product. Given like the software side of it, I think they're going to struggle with that in multiple countries as well. And also, if they're not building in China, they're not going to have as much of their cost advantage as they had before. So a lot of people ask me like, why, what's going to happen when the Chinese come to the US? Like, well, first off, the US is really going to protect their big three auto. And they're going to make the import duties rather steep. And then if there's pushback on it internationally, even if one of these companies were to set up in the US, they just wouldn't be as efficient with their manual assembly and labor processes in the US as they are in China. And BYD, their CEO is on the record, and I know him personally, by the way. He's on the record saying, look, we've got a labor problem in our company. We have too much labor. So BYD building in the United States, they're not going to have that kind of, by the way, they're not making a lot on EVs, even the ones they build in China. I think they have to, the last time Tesla and BYD margins were synchronized, I think it was Q1 of this year. And I think Tesla had basically made 8 times per car that BYD makes. So for every one car Tesla ships, they'd have to ship 8 to make equivalent margins. So yeah, I mean, long story, your question was about India and India capability. There's certainly assemblers I'm aware of. There's certainly component suppliers. I think Tesla's going to come in and they're going to want to set up general assembly, and they're going to want to build their core supply base around them and kind of do it the Tesla way. And they're not going to do a joint venture. So I know BYD offered their first entry, was rejected, and that was a JV offering. I forgot the name of the partner in India, but that was a JV offering to both JV on general assembly and then also work within their supply base.
Yeah, so that was rejected, which was interesting. Do you have a sense of why India wouldn't have? The headlines on that were that India is upset with China and they didn't want BYD because of security issues and such as that. Do you think it was the JV relationship that was a bigger issue, or what do you think?
No, I think it comes down to India's competing with China on economically and militarily, and it's those two issues. And if they let BYD in, who's on their way to being a very high volume player, they could crowd out their own ability to produce and export as well. So, and they don't want to give necessarily access to their own market as well. And the border dispute, I'm sure, has something to do with it. So there's a number of reasons for them to not cooperate. Doesn't mean this is over. I'm sure they'll continue to try to negotiate something, but I think India is very serious about not wanting to fall economically too far behind, especially in this area of EV.
So you say the CEO at BYD, and he's
Yep.
about as enigmatic as Elon is boisterous or something. We know so little about him. I've read everything I could find online about him. Some people compare him to Elon in terms of his kind of entrepreneurial excellence.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's built this thing from nothing. He was a poor farm boy that just came up and was able to build this empire. What were your takes? What did you think about him?
Yeah. Yeah. We met about 20 years ago. I was working on designing the supply chain, the sourcing business around Razor, the Motorola Razor product. And we had already set up manufacturing at Foxconn and worked with Terry Gao's team there. And it was a massive hit product. We needed more capacity. So we started working with BYD, and they were in their very early days of component manufacturing. They were also in their very early days of auto development and even EV development. I worked with them for more than a decade, and know Mr. Wang pretty well. And he's in his mid-50s. He's a chemical engineer, very sharp, very bright, very driven. They have a pretty actually, the auto team, a lot of his auto leadership team came over from the components business, and several people I work with, like Stella Lee, for example, very sharp people, very driven. And, I would say, that they've basically built up from nothing. They've built up their own battery business, and they've been working on this. Again, they've been working on battery design since the mid 2000s. They started, again, the mobile phone area of it, and then they've obviously expanded. So very entrepreneurial, very driven. Again, he's a very sharp, very technical person as well. So I have a lot of respect for them, but they're kind of on a different playing level with that, comparing them to Tesla. So they've done a good job with vertical integration. They've created a components business. They've created a battery business, and that's giving them a fairly decent edge in EV to do that integration at General Assembly. But I think where they're going to struggle is in a couple of areas. One is they're pretty, and this is public information. I don't have any inside information, but they're pretty manual in their approach to labor and labor processes, and that's happened for a long time in China, and that's going to hurt when you try to expand auto manufacturing globally. The second thing is around software. Do they have software expertise? Of course they do. They're building and shipping cars and other products. But in terms of like localizing that software to multiple regions and then doing full self-driving and autonomy and AI development, it's not clear that expertise is there. So I think those are a couple of their blind spots, but I have a lot of respect for them and their team and what they've done to date.
Are the other makers I've done a lot of business in China, and I've been over there watching, the employees sitting on the floor, scraping things off by hand and whatnot. I've seen, yes, and that, of course, that was, 30 years ago, but it's probably still happening in some regions. What do you know anything about the other automakers, the other major automakers, the Geelys and the SAICs and these guys? Are they also having the same issues in terms of being able to move into modernity with regard to manufacturing and assembly?
Yeah, there's some variations. So there's some. So I do know the founder of Li Auto. He used to work with me as my colleague at Lenovo, and he's since departed, I think, in the last 8 to 10 months. But they all have different strengths and expertise, and they're the key is they're moving quickly. Like they move very fast. They develop cars very fast. They ship very quickly. But there's key elements, I would say, strategically that they all kind of have gaps in certain areas, and that's why for Tesla, the strength that they've built up in China, Tom Zhu and his leadership and his team, I think it's pretty critical because they're kind of bringing kind of the China way back to bringing that back to Tesla and bringing that expertise back to Tesla. Local China sourcing. You're seeing a lot of, you've seen at least reports of them asking a lot of the vendors in China to set up, for operations domestically in Mexico, for example. So I like that Tesla has that strength there. But all the Chinese EV makers, I haven't studied all of them, but I am familiar with some of the personnel. Like again at BYD, I've studied, and I am familiar with some of the personnel at Li Auto. Those are two of I think the top three. Then you have NIO and XPeng. They all have some expertise. Li Auto is growing very well. They had a fantastic quarter. So I think they're gonna these companies are gonna grow and do well, but they have to get the recipe down in terms of operating margins and gross margins. It's not going to strictly come with volume. They're gonna have to figure it out from a design and manufacturing perspective, how to be more efficient and to create something that can actually scale globally versus just scale domestically.
Okay, so if you were sitting right now and Elon, or not Elon, a startup called you and said, "We've got the greatest design ever for a new EV, and we're trying to decide whether to put our first plant in China or India."
It's a great question, Randy. I think there's a number of implications. So one is the first question I would come up with is where is your customer base? Because you want your source of supply to be as close to your customer base as possible. It reduces network latency, reduces all the transportation logistics costs. So that would be the first question I would ask. And then there's a number of other questions in terms of like the product and the capability, and are you trying to be a global player? Because I would say the time element, the time from T equals 0 to starting this effort to being ramped up would be much faster, I believe, in China today. Mm-hmm. I think India over time will catch up to that. But I think the time from starting at T equals 0 to India to you being in mass production, I think would be greater at time. So it'd be longer. That would be the downside of India.
Yeah. So India's labor at this point cheaper?
It depends. It honestly depends by region and where you're doing, like major city versus major city. I don't have the stats in front of me right now, but you can certainly find cheaper labor depending on where you set up. Same thing between China to Vietnam, you can, but then you have to look at the total cost of everything. If it takes you 3 times longer, or if you don't have the kind of the support system around that labor, like the fixture development, for example, or the tooling shops, which you'd be well aware of. Like if you don't have these certain things and they make less efficient tools, but the labor's cheaper, that may hurt you in the end. So you have to look at kind of the full picture. Labor is one big component of it.
So if we ask the question slightly differently, the company is looking to produce a mid-range car, a $35,000 car, or the company's planning to make an $18,000 car. Would that make the choice easier in terms of having a bigger middle class already in China versus not having that middle class quite yet in India?
Yeah, I think it would. And I also think, again, I think you can get the market faster in China. I think the supply base is more mature. I think the labor population may be a bit more mature. But this is where India has to catch up. And this is why they want to pull a company like Tesla in so they can close that gap.
What do you think about the engineering schools? The famous story on India, their top story, I think, for luring new manufacturing into India is their, I forget the number. It's a lot of engineering schools turning out, I think, more new engineers each year than the United States does. What about the quality of those engineering schools and the engineers they're turning out? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, there's a kind of a mixed bag anywhere you go, but I will tell you that I personally work with some of the sharpest people, come from those engineering schools that I've worked with. So, it's hard to give kind of like a one size fits all answer. Obviously like the Stanfords of the world and so forth, I think operate, MIT, they operate on a kind of a different level. Mm-hmm. But I think, I can't speak with a lot of granularity. Other than that, I worked with very talented people out of India, and China. But again, it's that gap could be closing also pretty quickly in terms of what they're teaching, AI and so forth. I think there's a big difference between being trained and learning and kind of learning AI, being an AI engineer than a software engineer. There's just a big difference. So not, I don't think there's one answer, but I just know that I've worked with, there's a tremendous amount of engineering talent in India. I don't think that's the shortage. It's more of, trained in those disciplines to produce, auto and to produce EV, and then the software for EVs, the localization piece of it. I think that's the piece of it. I can't give you a good barometer between India and China there. That they may actually be pretty close.
Let's go back to China for a minute. What about the economic implosion that appears to be happening? Now, this implosion, people need to be aware that the implosion that everybody's talking about means that for some reason, their GDP increase might be under 6%. So it's not
Yeah.
like they're going into the negative. It's not like they're instead of growing at 10 or 12 or 20%, they might grow at less than 6% this year. So, but given that, their middle class is being the wealth of the middle class is being destroyed by this real estate bust, and they've got a demographic issue. Are these long-term issues, do you think, going to be devastating to China, or do you think it's just going to slow them down from what everybody thought maybe they would pass the United States in GDP within 7 or 10 years or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. There's a number of things that come to mind. One is like last week, they stopped reporting on youth unemployment. They said, oh, we've got to work on, the numbers in the reporting system. The economic numbers out of China, I mean, it's hard to really trace, like, what's the measurement system? Are these things being measured the same way every time? But it's clear that there's warning signals both, and they kind of happen in the form of like, when an event actually just has to happen, like there's nowhere, like a default, like real estate defaults, like when these things actually come to a terminal point is when they can't really kind of run from it anymore. Um, so, so yeah, I think it's a pretty significant factor at this point. Um, I would say that both the youth unemployment, the middle class, and their PPI, they've gone actually deflationary. Their producer prices have
Yes.
gone deflationary, which means they're not just increasing at a lower rate; they're actually decreasing month over month. So they're going to export that deflation too. I think that's one thing I think people need to realize, that they're going to export a lot of deflation, and that's going to have impact on in our geography, for example. So I think when you take that producer price deflation, the youth unemployment, you take what's going on in the real estate markets, and you kind of put all this together. I would say there's certainly warning signs. They have a gigantic ability to just turn the spigot on, whether it's interest rates or massive cash infusions. So I mean, don't underestimate when they actually go in and they want to do some stimulus. It could be quite large, and maybe things recover then pretty quickly. But then I have to look at like what's happening with the yuan and how far is that going down. And I think so that's also a concern right now for them in their economy. So you take all these things together, it's certainly, I would say it's a factor. If you're making a decision like, am I going to put manufacturing there or not? It's certainly a factor. I don't know if the number, I know that India's reported, has their own reporting, system as well. It's hard to compare these things between countries. You almost have to look for these other data points that, can't be manipulated.
Yeah, well, of course, we've seen all through the Asian region. We've seen. I happened to go on a trip a couple of years ago where it was Singapore, Tokyo, and Seoul, and those three countries basically didn't exist in the 50s. I mean, they were flat fields, and now they're
Mhm.
three of the safest, cleanest, and most productive places on Earth. So we could certainly see an India miracle, like the China miracle or the Singapore miracle, based on your understanding of India. Do you anticipate a India miracle?
I do. I think I'm confident that they've got great people. They've got a growing kind of middle class. Again, it's not, you know, people are like, what vehicle is Tesla going to ship there and actually get in volume? And I said, well, it's probably going to be something where the government has to stimulate, EV sales, and then Tesla's got to get this vehicle, into the low to mid 20s, plus some stimulus, and now you're talking about a product that can get further adopted. But they were saying that too about high-end smartphones, and they sell actually very well in India. So yeah, is it possible there's a miracle there? Sure. And I think there's other Asian countries as well that are they're kind of ramping up from a manufacturing perspective. Vietnam is another one. They've got some fairly big awards in the consumer electronics industry. Um, and they're doing well. But again, when you enter these countries, it's not like you can really just, one of the problems that happened actually over the last decade is the manufacturing systems that because everybody was just making a ton of money. There wasn't a lot of work on manufacturing, as much work as probably needed on manufacturing efficiency. So when these big, huge tech companies want to like lift up that process out of China and bring it to Vietnam, it's super complex. It's huge. It's gigantic. And you have a lot of know-how and you have a lot of experience in China that isn't as easy to just transplant over into another country. And then you also don't have the amount of tooling shops and fixture shops and all this other expertise that people don't necessarily think about when you're setting up a factory, all that infrastructure that's needed around a factory. So all that has to ramp up as well. By the way, the US is going to experience the same thing with onshoring. A lot of expertise that the US had. Yeah. A lot of expertise that the US had, they just don't have it anymore. I brought a smartphone factory back to the US from Motorola and Google back in 2012, 2013 with a couple of my colleagues. We set up a million unit a month operation in Texas. And we had one of the biggest surprises for us is we had trouble, staffing up a 2,500 person operation. We had trouble finding the people. We had trouble finding the people that could do manual assembly, do automated assembly work, and man those operations, because we've been gapped for decades of people that don't have that experience or capability. So anyway, it kind of speaks to that.
And sometimes even in the United States, that's a regional issue. I mean, Texas is the fastest growing state. 25 years ago, they had one of the top 10 cities in the country. Now they have four of the top 10 cities in the country. But I know other companies that had moved to Texas, and they got to Texas and all of a sudden they had to move a lot of the work back to California because they couldn't find the people that had the skills to do it in Texas. They didn't have the university system that other states did. They had to build that infrastructure. Yeah. Well, let me ask it that same question, so that particular issue a slightly different way. There was the famous dirty work theory, where we saw Japan start with dirty work, and then slowly but surely they built to where they were a tech country, no longer wanted the dirty work, so it went to Taiwan. Taiwan did the dirty work for a number of years, and then they became tech, and the dirty work went to Korea, and each of these, and then finally went to China. So we watched that thing happen over and over again. But in each case, you had this, what you're talking about, this tooling and the dies and the companies that were supporting all of this. It all happened internally and organically. Are we now in a different era where India, as the next maybe manufacturer for the world, is importing a lot of that tech? Indonesia or Vietnam might be importing those tools and die makers and all that kind of support rather than growing it organically. How do you see that maybe making a difference in how these countries do over the next decade?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture. I do think they're developing it organically. They may need some help from so these multinational companies, let's take Foxconn, for example. They're a Taiwanese-based company. They set up most of their manufacturing in China. And now even them, they want to diversify. Some people think, Foxconn's a Chinese company. It's not. It's a Taiwanese company. But obviously they see what's going on. They want to diversify. So when they want to diversify and they want to go to Vietnam, they've got to rely on their China teams to help, ramp up some of that capability. So what they'll do is they'll take people and they'll put them on short-term assignments and leave them there until they can kind of ramp that capability up with the locals. So yeah, there's this interesting thing of dirty work because obviously Vietnam isn't soaking up all that supply for their population. They're net major exporter now, especially in the electronics industry. In that example. So, and that's what I worry about actually with the U.S. is you bring this CHIPS Act and you bring silicon manufacturing here, which I'm hugely supportive of. I think the bill is brilliant. I think it's great, and we should be doing this because it's literally it's got national security implications. But is the team thinking about the whole supply network and thinking about the whole infrastructure of people around it? TSMC has said, look, we're delaying this project in Arizona. We can't physically find the labor. My other big concern about this is where will the chips go once they're built? Because if we don't have that general assembly and system level assembly being set up, we don't have more of the big mega cap 10 companies bringing back assembly here for local distribution, then you're going to have the U.S. building silicon and sending it back over to China and sending it back over to India. And now you're actually going to create net inflation because now you've created this longer supply network between you and the customer, because then they're going to build product and they're going to want to ship it back here. So we have to have that next level of the supply chain. If we're serious about silicon, then we should be serious about general assembly as well, and ramping that up in the U.S.
And would it also be a case of where when government gets involved, sometimes there's inefficiencies in especially marketing theorization? And so wouldn't it be a lot of the case of if we're going to build silicon here, we're not going to be building the kind of silicon that could be built anywhere. You're going to want to build maybe you're going to niche yourself in the stuff that's a little more sophisticated, can be sold for a higher price. And then, of course, it means you really need those top engineers and inventors, scientists, in order to compete with National Semi and others.
Yeah, TSMC and Samsung aren't setting up here to build the 30 plus nanometer product for the old auto products. They're setting up to do 3 to 5 nanometer node silicon. So this is the state of the art, and you're going to need the right people. They will figure this out. It's a question of time, and it's a question of what's the cost structure going to be, because now you have TSMC, for example, exporting their Taiwanese labor, their engineers here to for setup. Right. How long does that take? When does the gap close? I'm confident that we will figure this out in the U.S. What I'm not confident in is that are we thinking about the rest of the supply chain, so we go all the way from silicon to the consumer in the U.S. without having to take a detour out to assemble the product.
So last part of the conversation has to do with the mix of the countries in Asia, especially in South Asia, but including China, in terms of the supply chain as a whole. So again, everybody seems to be very, very concerned about China's hold on some mining activity, and also really concerned about their hold on the processing into usable, taking the mined minerals and processing, in particular lithium, of course, but others. Would you see that this would be one of the great opportunities maybe for an Indonesia, or do you think it will be more of in India themselves will get into processing lithium and other mined materials.
Yeah, the more vertically integrated this gets, the better it is for these companies, because these economics are going to continue to be challenged. So if you could literally put your factory on top of your refining process and your refining process on top of a mine, I mean, that's ultimately, that's what Tesla is nearly doing here in Texas. And, that's going to be, I think it's going to be critical. I think countries are going to use, and they're going to use their economic and manufacturing capability as a weapon. And, it's going to be a weapon, and it's going to be a weapon for trade. It could turn kinetic in some examples. And that's why you have to be very careful about what industries we source from abroad, the whole globalization piece versus onshoring. And we have to pick these critical lanes, and we have to make sure that we're ultimately set. We saw what happened during the pandemic, and we can't have ourselves in that situation. That was done over multiple decades. There wasn't one point in time to kind of just point to, but we've got to figure this out. So the best thing for those countries in Asia is to not have to crisscross product between them as much as possible, I believe. Now there'll be some, I mean, we have to study the trade agreements a little bit more, because there's some pretty favorable trade agreements between them. And if you've got a kind of a center of excellence, or if you've got capability in one area, or you've got minerals that just don't exist in other countries, well, then you are going to be in that situation where you're going to have to source from abroad. So it's really kind of situation dependent.
So it would be kind of simple, it would seem, almost like the Texas example for Tesla, or a Tesla relationship to build a refinery in South India, which would be super close to Australia. So the lithium could come straight out of Australia, at least, into a refinery, and, like you say, have the factory practically sitting on top of the refinery.
Yeah, and then also think of that. Not only we talked about the assembly to the consumer, but also think about the reverse side of it, of when that car, you want to extract that battery and extract those minerals and then remanufacture it. You have to think about setting that operation up as well. The reverse logistics side that always is kind of, it gets thought of as, something like after the fact. And I think there's, at some point we're going to get to a point where we have all the minerals above earth that we need. And the question is can we do a better job of remanufacturing it?
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. I had one more question. How does Mexico fit into this whole thing? I don't want to be a nationalist. I don't want to, put down Mexico in any way, shape, or form. Mexico seems to be sliding into third world status, while these other countries are moving out of third world into second world status. How is Mexico going to turn around, or is Mexico going to be kind of this afterthought?
Mexico's got a pretty big footing in the car industry and the consumer electronics industry. And this delay with Tesla, it's a bit concerning. We don't actually know what's going on. We don't know what's causing the delay, but hopefully they figure it out. But yeah, for a period of time, I would say going back 20 years, your first sourcing move out of the U.S., if you were trying to go and reduce costs, you would go to Mexico, and especially for supply going to the Western Hemisphere, you would go and you'd go build in Mexico. Everybody would head down south. We all did it, and that's changed. And I've gone through the economics. We've gone through the economics with it, and even building in China and exporting back here. it became more favorable. So yeah, there's a concern here if they don't, if they don't figure this out. Now there's some free trade agreements that are going to help them. You know, there's so the North America Free Trade Agreement is going to help them in that respect. So they're going to get a big assist from that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they could turn it around. But my goodness, the trajectory that China's on, the trajectory that India's on, Vietnam, Thailand. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to want to build product there if you can, depending on where you're actually distributing it.
Yeah, so a lot of times what happens with America being still the place where everybody wants to move to and being wide open to allowing people to move here, sometimes we end up basically mining the intellectual capabilities of these countries. And I'm worried that that's what's happened with Mexico, with the enormous number of people that have come over. I had my manufacturing facility was, 80, 90, probably actually in the manufacturing facility part of the company, we were probably 100% Mexican, and most of them recent immigrants. And there was some sharp people that were working for me. They actually claimed that my company was their university. And when I sold, they went off and started their own bottle manufacturing business, and they're doing just fine 16 years later. So
good for them.
So a lot of sharp people, immigrate. Elon Musk, immigrated because he wanted to go where he could really be in a free environment where he could really exercise his muscles. Do you think that's what's happening in Mexico by and large?
Well, yeah, in any country where the living conditions, the safety or crime, and the ability to move up, if those things are hampered in any way, you start losing the good people first. And that could be an issue. I wouldn't say I have my finger on the pulse in terms of, setting up a factory, a number of years ago to now, and what's the difference or the delta. But I think anytime you create an environment where safety is an issue, the ability to move up is an issue, or the education system is an issue, you're going to lose the good people first. So it'd certainly be something that they should keep their eye on.
Yeah. All right. Any last thoughts about Asia that I haven't covered? When I'm saying Asia, I'm going to count Australia in there, even though the Aussies seem to be a self-sufficient island or continent or whatever they are. They seem to be very self-sufficient these days. Any other thoughts about this entire Asia issue with regard to automotive?
No, I mean, Aussies are great. I think it's going to be interesting to watch India versus China. India wants to be a major player. I think they're going to pull on Tesla. I think they're going to give Tesla very favorable terms, and they're going to want to get moving quickly. So I'm going to be interested to watch this. I'm going to be interested to see how Tesla kind of manages the political side of this between the two countries. But so far, I think they've done a good job. There was an order of Elon's visits, that he did a couple months ago, and he made sure that showing face in China is very critical, and he made sure he did that, and with the top leaders there as well, and then he's like, okay, we're going to have this India thing as well. So show face in China, strength in China, announce that you're expanding in China. Good. Oh, by the way, there's a big population of people in India we'd like to serve and grow energy, right? Clean energy. And it's not only going to be a car and auto story. It's going to be mega packs. It's going to be, the whole energy side of it as well. So I think the Chinese leadership should be kind of respectful and cognizant of, like, they're not, going to India to get out of China. They're growing in China, and they want to set up in India to service that population. So, but it gives Tesla, what I like is it gives them some geographical redundancy. Tesla also has a very talented leadership team that are from India. They've got several leaders on their team, leaders of supply chain, leaders of finance, that are from there as well. So I like that in terms of getting this deal done, and also kind of for the long term and success with India. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch. I don't know if Vietnam's going to be on the scene in terms of like a major player, but I know they're a pretty big player in consumer electronics. So it's going to be interesting to watch. Does China, do they come out of this pandemic? Do they come out of this little bit of economic malaise, and do they emerge even stronger, or do these other countries start catching up? I think that's going to be the exciting thing to watch.
All right. Well, that's great, Jeff. Totally appreciate you being a part of this series. And I just want to say to everybody listening, remember now, tomorrow morning, Saturday morning, there is going to be the kind of the summation of this where Larry Goldberg comes back. Larry, who's had tons of experience manufacturing in India as well.
Brilliant.
And also around the world, South Africa and Europe and the United States. He's been in all these different places. He knows the territory. Of course, I have a big background in Asia and as well. And then we have, of course, Brian Wong, who you should have, if you haven't listened to last night, be sure, here's the card above. Make sure you listen to Brian's conversation about China specifically, because again, Brian was born in Hong Kong. He spent time, lived in Taiwan, has relatives in China and in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, and does a ton of business and consulting in that territory. So the combination, I think, of the four of us should give you as good. I think this is CNBC level stuff. What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I think you have a great panel. Me aside, I think the people you rattled off, I think you've got a great panel of experts, Randy, and you yourself as well. So this is a great thing to be a part of, and I appreciate your insights as well, and kind of pulling all this together. And it's been great.
All right, thanks, Jeff, and to all of you out there, it's been great talking to you.
Click the link below to get your paperback, Kindle, or audiobook now.